Hey folks, this is JR with DIY Prepper. Welcome to the channel, and today we are going to be talking about survival gear that you should avoid like the plague. These are going to be pieces of gear that a lot of us, when we get started as preppers or we get into survival or even other things like camping or hunting, we think are going to be good ideas. They look like good ideas on paper. The little descriptions of them in the catalog or on the website that we order from, they sound awesome. But it takes us a grand total of 30 seconds of actually using said piece of gear before we realize we have made an absolutely horrible mistake. So, let's get started. The first piece of gear that I'm going to pick on is going to be hollow-handled survival knives. This particular blade is one that I picked up, I believe, when I was like 15 or 16. I was in high school. And I think it was actually one of my first knife purchases. I might have had a couple of small Swiss Army knives or something like that. But when I got into high school, that's when I really got into knives and things like that. So I picked this up kind of at a large local flea market type thing. And I thought it would be a great idea because, you know, it has this survival kit here in the handle that I have since lost since I was like 15 or 16. I mean, that was a long time ago. It had a compass hot glued to the pommel of the knife, which didn't work, just to be honest. Wow, the threads aren't even mating right. Anyway, and then we get to the sheath. I'll go ahead and put this bad boy back up real quick. Sorry. And there's supposed to be a sharpening stone in here. I don't know if you can see that all that well, but it's practically impossible to get out. And don't get me wrong, I know that the original Rambo knife, that this horrible piece of junk was based off of, was actually a custom knife that was really good. And I think there might have been some iterations between then and now that aren't as terrible as this one. But most of these knives have one very major problem in common. Where the blade attaches to the handle inside of here, which you can't see, it's usually something like a screw or a rivet. And if you try to do any larger knife tasks with this, like chopping or something like I did, it's not going to take it very long before it starts to become loose. I don't know if y'all can see this, but if you can see it and maybe hear it, you notice there's a lot of play between the blade and the handle now. Well, it took about a grand total of a minute and a half maybe for that much play to develop. I was at deer camp. I decided to chop some wood, something. I think I just got bored and was wanting to wail on something. And so there I went, chop, 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 chop. You know, little 15, 16-year-old dumb JR, chop, 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 chop. And then I noticed how loose that blade was getting. And then even me, as a 15 or 16-year-old kid, I was like, this is terrible. And it has since been in its sheath, been shoved in a backpack or a box or something, stored out of sight, out of mind, except for when I pull it out from time to time to go, wow, that was bad. But if you're looking for a better alternative, try a knife that doesn't try to do quite as much stuff at once, because even the saw blade's not really that good. I mean, if you look at the saw blade, I mean, it's really thick. The most you're going to be able to do is maybe go through some roots with that, and then that might even be frustrating. I would pick a different tool for that anyway. But if you want a knife that's actually a knife and will do its job well, then I suggest something like the Becker BK7. Doesn't have to be this exact knife, but it has a lot of traits that you want from a larger fixed blade knife. Like you will notice, going from the blade all the way down, except for you can't because I have tape over the handle just to give me a little bit more grip, you'll notice that it's all just one solid piece of steel, and that's really what you want in a more hard use, larger fixed blade knife. That way you can do some chopping without having to worry about the knife falling apart. And there's some debate onto whether or not it's actually good uses, but you can do batoning also, and you don't have to worry about a blade such as that breaking. And then, of course, there's other companies besides, you know, K-Bar. That's from their Becker line. There's your Essie knives, your Ontario knives, all those guys. But point is, pick something that is just a solid chunk of steel and doesn't have all the extra stuff to fail on it. The next piece of survival gear that you should avoid like the plague, and this is probably the one that I hate the absolute most, is going to be cheap knockoff Swiss style knives. And there's just a whole host of problems with knives like these. So the blade, to begin with, is going to be incredibly loose. I don't know how well y'all can see that, but from where I am, I can even see the knife moving inside, or the blade moving inside of the tool itself. And that's not good. This particular one is sharper than a lot of them, but I've had some that I've never been able to put a decent edge on the blade. And then the tools like the scissors, a lot of the other tools just barely work, and I think a lot of them are just there to have space on the tool. But if I try to cut my fingernail with that, oh, that's the bad finger, don't want to do that to the camera. Anyway, oh, look at that. Do you see that? That is some ridiculous kind of nonsense. Okay, then let's compare that to a real Swiss Army knife. This is a Champion model from, I believe, the mid-'80s that I found at an antique store. So just watch this. Watch how easy. Boom. Just, hardly any resistance whatsoever. And my biggest issue with those cheap Swiss-style knives is that they give knives like this a bad name. It kind of tarnishes their reputation, because people that don't really know the difference between one or the other, they think these are junk because they had one of those, and they're not. The tools on this thing, they're all tight. There's not a whole lot of play. I mean, there might be a tiny, tiny bit, but it's not anything that's going to make the tool difficult to use. And while you might say, you know, some of those tools aren't really the most useful, I don't really need that, that's fair, but they are designed pretty well. I think that the chisel's kind of in a rather unusable spot on Swiss Army knives, especially the larger ones. But the quality difference between a knockoff and the real thing, it's just almost indescribable. You need to hold one and then hold the other and kind of play with them a second to see how much of a difference there is. But while it's not going to be able to fill kind of the same roles as that BK7 I showed you earlier, and the wood saw is not going to be as effective as a Baco Laplander, it is going to be something that you're going to be able to use. It's going to hold up over the years. I mean, this is from the mid-'80s, and I mean, the tools still work fine. There's not really hard, I mean, there's a little bit of rust, but it's not much at all. So this is going to hold up. That other one's not. And if you're in a situation where you need some tools and you need a blade, this is going to work for you in a pinch. Then along those same lines, cheap multi-tools are another piece of survival gear that you should avoid. Here I have a Victorinox Swiss tool, and that's produced by the same people who make the Swiss Army knives. And when you're talking about these, I really suggest staying with either Victorinox, Leatherman, or one of those guys for multi-tools, because if you're talking about a multi-tool, then you're going to want something with a fairly beefy pair of pliers. And if you're using pliers, you're really going to probably want to bear down on those to either, you know, loosen something, to cut wire, whatever the case may be. And one thing I've noticed about cheaper multi-tools is either the tools are ineffective, as in the case with the cheapo Swiss-style knives, or they're produced of materials that aren't able to handle the kind of forces that you might want to use on a multi-tool, because you're going to be using the pliers to grip and twist. You might be using other tools, maybe for some light prying. And a lot of the multi-tools I've seen, the metal is either really soft or it's too thin, and it's not going to hold up to that. It's going to bend, it might even break. So when it comes to multi-tools, really stick with the name brands, especially if it's something that you're wanting to use for survival. Maybe some of the cheap $10 ones, maybe you can get away with keeping those in like your kitchen drawer or something like that. But if you're going to be going out into the field with something, try to save up some money and get a good one if at all possible. The next piece of survival gear that you should avoid like the plague are small commando style wire saws. This one that I have here, this is just something that I picked up at a local store. But a lot of the times you see these in kind of small pocket kits, or people keep them in their backpacks thinking that, you know, they'll be able to saw branches and make nice, neat cuts on wood to build shelters or trim wood down so they can split it up into kindling and all that kind of stuff. And really what you're dealing with here is basically picture hanging wire that has been woven into a little bit of a more coarse pattern. And there's a couple of problems with these. And the first one is just how thin the metal is, given it has to be thin to saw through it, but it's not the strongest stuff. And one particular weak point is going to be where the wire goes into the handle. That could be a problem depending on how it's designed. A lot of the time, some of those saws don't have good handles. I mean, this is a fairly decent handle for this type of saw. A lot of times you just see like kind of key rings that you're supposed to put a stick through and kind of act as toggles. Probably the biggest problem with a saw like this is that it binds just super easy. A good alternative to a commando style wire saw is going to be a pocket chainsaw. A pocket chainsaw, it is going to cut a lot better than one of those wire saws. And as you can see, I mean, it actually is a pocket chainsaw. It's going to be a lot sturdier, a lot more durable. So I strongly recommend adding a pocket chainsaw to your kit rather than a wire commando style saw. The next piece of survival gear that you should avoid like the plague is going to be hybrid ferro rods. This particular one came with my pocket chainsaw. It has a ferro rod here and then a magnesium bar on the other side. And it's kind of like those, you know, magnesium blocks with the with the ferro rod on it. I mean, really, that's essentially what this is. But the problem with these is that they are made a lot of the times of the cheapest materials possible. And what I really don't like them is when you see pictures of them online, you think you're getting an actual ferro rod like this one, but you're not. You're getting something else. So I don't like that you're not really sure what you're getting, but also the magnesium that's on this thing, it's not really the best quality stuff. It's not going to light as well. And I really recommend staying away from ones like this. If you want to get one of the magnesium blocks, especially one that is US made, then those are probably going to be fine if you know how to use them. But me personally, my two kind of preferred options are either going to be a Bic lighter or a large diameter, large length ferro rod, just because you can get some huge sparks with this. And this wasn't that expensive. This is like a cheap $10 ferro rod, but it's gigantic. And what's good about a larger ferro rod is that you're going to be able to, of course, get more strikes out of it, but also if you're in a situation where your hands are cold or any other time when your dexterity is limited for one reason or another, a larger ferro rod is going to be a lot easier to grip onto, and you're going to get a lot more strikes with a larger ferro rod than you would with something like this that only has a tiny amount of ferrocerium on it. The next piece of survival gear that you should avoid like the plague is going to be cheap entrenching tools, or also known as tri-fold shovels. The one that I have here in my hand, this is actually a real one. This was produced by Ames, I believe, in 1983, and it is real military surplus. And the only thing wrong with it right now is it probably needs a little bit of oil on it. And on these original tools, you're going to find that the edges are going to be nice and sharpened so that you can use them for chopping. You can use this for some sawing if you need to, as it was originally intended to. And also, the metal's going to be strong enough to hold up to that kind of use and abuse. I mean, I've even seen people use these as hammers to drive in tent stakes. If you take a look at the cheap ones, though, the materials that they're produced of a lot of time is going to be thinner or much lower quality. So it's not going to be able to hold up to the type of use and abuse that the tool will experience if you're doing something like digging. And then the last piece of survival gear that you should avoid like the plague is going to be generic or overly tactical pocket survival kits. They have every single bad type of product almost that I have already mentioned before, just crammed in a little pocket tin. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that. I know Essie, I think they make like a pocket survival kit type thing, which of course, I mean, it's Essie, so it's going to be high quality. All the components are going to be great. And then even like the cheaper Coghlan's one, I've seen people do unboxings of those, and a lot of the stuff in there seemed pretty decent. So if you're wanting a pocket survival kit, either A, build it yourself, fill it with good stuff, or B, spend a little bit extra money and get one of those really good, really solid, almost professional grade style pocket tins. Well, that's all we got for today. Thank you guys for stopping by. And y'all, my purpose in this wasn't to like belittle anybody or, you know, like make fun of your gear or anything like that. It was to show you some of the limitations of some of these pieces of equipment to kind of maybe motivate people to A, avoid them, or B, upgrade them as time and funds allow. So thank you guys again for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.